Welcome to the back channel. I am Alejandro Leguizamo, your host. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting with John Tabashnik about preventing and addressing sexual aggression in college campuses. Over the last 30 years, John Tabashnik has developed educational materials and innovative sexual violence prevention programs for national, state, and local organizations. Her primary focus is on preventing the perpetration of sexually harmful behaviors, particularly in adolescents and young adults. Joan just completed a fellowship with the U.S. Department of Justice, the SMART office, with a focus on preventing the perpetration of campus sexual misconduct. She is continuing her consulting practice as well as her commitment to opening the door for healing and prevention for those at risk to cause harm. Visit www.joantabashnik.com for more information. So welcome, Joan. It's a pleasure to talk to you in general, but also a pleasure to talk to you about what's going on college campuses and with allegations or events where there's sexual coercion or aggression. So welcome.
Always great to talk with you, Alejandro.
Thank you. So could you tell us about your work on sexual assault prevention in colleges?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've been working in the field of sexual violence prevention for 30 years. But one of the things that over the past 7 years, I had a chance to, through my fellowship with the SMART office, I had a chance to actually work and focus specifically on the campus community. In the meantime, this past 7 years has been a time where there's been a lot of focus around sexual assault in general in the college community. And because of both my particular focus on prevention, which is on focusing on preventing the perpetration of sexual violence, it sort of offered a unique lens into what's happening on campus. And so I've had a chance to sort of look at what's happening in terms of Title IX, in terms of more awareness, in terms of more survivor activism on campuses. I had a chance to sort of work with both sort of individual survivor advocates as well as researchers. I think probably some of the most groundbreaking work that came out in the past sort of 7 years has been out of a project out of Columbia, which resulted in a book called Sexual Citizen. So I say anybody who really wants to sort of see a good overview of where we are sort of as of today, certainly Sexual Citizens is one of the great resources there. And I think what they've done and what I think ATSA members really can do is open up the lens of like, you really want to prevent sexual assault, sexual misconduct on campus before anyone is harmed. We need to begin to think about how to prevent the perpetration of sexual violence. And what I love about having a chance to talk to you is that we can talk with the understanding that not all people who cause harm are the same. And so there's a whole range of behaviors. And I think campuses are beginning to see that there's a real big difference between sexual harassment and sexual groping, sexual rape and attempted rape, that whole range of behaviors. But also what ATSA members bring to the table is you also understand there's a real difference in terms of people's cognitive understanding, people's developmental stage, people's motivations, people's tactics. All of those need to be taken into account as well, where colleges tend to use more of like a one-size-fits-all approach. So if this is rape or attempted rape, there's one response. If it's sexual harassment, it's another one, without looking at all of the different factors that an ATSA member would just sort of naturally look at. And that to me is the real contribution I think ATSA members can make right now in terms of the conversation that's happening around preventing the perpetration of sexual misconduct, sexual assault on campus.
And I think that it's really for those of us who are in academia, it would be in some ways fairly easy to be able to like help our universities in this context. It could be seen as like, oh, great, another thing to do, but this is we're in environments where there's so much sexual coercion that goes unreported, that it really behooves us, I like using that word, to kind of like do something about it in order to raise awareness and also show how complicated this matter is. Not that university administration like oh no, it's simple, yes or no, but to really show the potential, the continuum of behavior, and when to know when somebody would need more in order to prevent further inappropriate behaviors.
Yeah, there's also, we're at a particular moment in time right now where under President Trump, there was a rewriting of the Title IX regulations. And one of the things that there's always, whatever policy, whatever you agree with or not, there's always unintended consequences. And one of the, I think, unintended consequences of those regulations is that they opened up two doors that hadn't been on campuses before. And one of them was that there had to be equitable services for people who have been accused, as well as people who have made the accusation. Until then, there really was a focus just on how to help the victims and survivors. And I think for reasons that probably I personally may not even agree with, they also, but I agree with the outcome of it, which they said there had to be equitable services. What do we do for the person who's been accused? So campuses are saying, realizing they had nothing for those students, and that opens up a door. The other door that's opened up, which I think relates to what you were just saying, is that between 80–90% of cases of sexual misconduct are never reported, never get to the administration. And so what under Donald Trump, what they opened up was that the idea of alternative resolution. So it doesn't necessarily have to go through an investigative process, but that actually, if a student says, I just want an apology, or I just want to make sure that person understands and doesn't do this again, they don't want them necessarily to go through investigation. They just want them to have that understanding. So now that there's an opportunity for alternative resolutions, and what has changed again in the newest regulations is that before you had to make a formal report, and then both parties had to agree to alternative resolutions. Now it doesn't have to go through a formal reporting process. So the door, what I love, what I'm seeing, the door keeps opening wider and wider. So let's, like, how do you have to understand that these are students, which especially traditional age students are legally adults, but developmentally they're still adolescents. And as adolescents, they will make mistakes. And what's opening up wider and wider is the opportunity for a campus to help students realize that you've made a mistake and how to apologize or how to make repair for those mistakes. And certainly, most importantly, how to change your behavior so you don't make that mistake again. And I'm using the term mistake because I think from the person who caused that harm, I want to use a term that is not judgmental, but I wanted to say that from the victim and survivor's point of view, whatever that motivation is, the impact, of that quote mistake is huge, can be huge. And I don't want to minimize that trauma by using that term. So I just want to be clear for people listening. I know you understand that, Alejandro, but I want to make sure people understand that I'm not minimizing the harm that can be caused by someone making a really bad judgment call. But I'm excited about the fact that it allows people to address those 90% of people, as you say, who don't even go to administration, but people on campus know that some problematic sexual behavior has been perpetrated.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually wondering, the older I get, the younger college students seem, or is it that less agency and more kind of like adolescent they seem? But then again, probably when I was in college, also people like looked at us and I'm like, oh yeah, no, they're still adolescents. But they seem in some ways wiser than we were, and in some ways less prepared than we were. But all right, that's my.
No, I think
actually, but...
no, I think particularly the students on campus have sort of missed, because of COVID, have missed 2 years of socialization. And I love sort of listening to NPR, and they had a commentator talking about how misbehaved the 2-year-old dogs were, who for the dog shows in Great Britain, the famous dog shows, because they hadn't had 2 years of socialization. So it's showing up in all kinds of odd places, but I think you're right. I think that students certainly have access to tons of information, but they haven't had the same sort of socialization that usually would happen for a college student entering college today, or that entered last year. And I recently, I'm working on a project with for the National Sexual Violence Resource Center of taking a brochure I wrote for Stop It Now 20 years ago and rewriting it for the campus setting. And it's about how do you have conversations with someone when you're concerned about the behaviors. And I did a series of focus groups. And what I love about when you do focus groups and you have an idea of a project that you think is really brilliant, and you realize the first thing you realize is that, well, students actually won't read a brochure. And the second thing I learned is that students actually don't feel comfortable having conversations. So, so we kind of we're developing actually a number of like Instagram and maybe some TikTok, interventions and things of like, but what we realize is that there's not a lot of information about, if you're concerned about my behaviors, how do you have that conversation with me? And then there's also, like, I found nothing out there about how do I receive that information, and again, what I love about working with young people, I have a sort of someone working with me who's in their 20s, Emma Helper, and as she's reading what I'm writing, and I'm talking about, if you're having a conversation with me, it's really important for me to first, center myself and take a deep breath, and then just to listen to what you have to say, listen to the impact that my actions might have had on you. And then before I say anything, think about what I want to say, think about how to, like, what my words might have, and Emma immediately putting together Instagram, she goes, well, it's a BLT. I'm going, a BLT, what are you, trying to, like, well, it's first you breathe, take a deep breath, then you listen to what the impact of what you've done, and then think before you talk. And so people, the students are finding different ways of crafting information in a way that at least I find that it's beyond, my idea of like writing a brochure, but having a conversation is very old school. But some of the same skills you said, like some of the better skills, can help some of the places where they still need skill development. And it's just a different ratio than we would have had, I think, when we went into college, a few years ago. So
that's right. Yeah, I was thinking about, like, TikTok had to be involved in some way. And I do see the impact of really poor communication in person. Everything being done through text. In some ways, maybe that would be a good documentation for consent, if they're actually texting those conversations. But it's that brings me to what are some unique factors that you have seen in colleges that could contribute to sexual coercion or sexual aggression, aside from the age, of course?
I mean, I think that what I'm sort of seeing, and what I love, sort of this something, a project which a number of ATSA members actually were involved with, that also got funded through the SMART office, was looking at situational prevention. So if we understand that there are students who are at higher risk for lots of different reasons, and David Finkelhor I actually had this precondition model for abusive behavior, which actually fits well into the college community as well, is that there needs to be a way that if of my own inhibitions being reduced, for the community's sort of ability sort of to be reduced, for the person who might be harmed, to also their resistance being reduced. And in the college campus, like, all of the preconditions are there, so I may be drinking for the first time, so that, and alcohol has absolutely been, there's a lot of research which show the link between increased alcohol. People are going away for the first time maybe in their lives. They don't have their church, they don't have their community, they don't have their families, and they're maybe in groups which are in some way encouraging perpetration behaviors. So and then because the drinking is mutual, and also the person who they may be causing harm will also be drunk. So there's a number of factors, individually as well as in the situation. And this idea of situational prevention is, how do you change the environment so that you're actually not encouraging perpetration, but you're encouraging safety, and some of those factors will be sort of in terms of the access to alcohol, for sure, that there's research which shows that just to increase the price of alcohol in the area surrounding a campus, your drinking goes down and the sexual assault will go down. There was a graduate student who read her dissertation where she compared two different campuses, one in the South where that fraternities were not allowed to have parties in their houses. They had to have it on campus. There had to be a monitor, to a Midwest university where fraternities could have off-campus parties where there was no monitor and they were allowed to have alcohol. And they found the level of sexual assault, as you imagine, at the fraternities in the Midwest was far beyond whatever was happening in sort of this university in the South. So looking at the environment is a huge piece in terms of how to reduce perpetration of sexual misconduct. And again, two projects got funded through the SMART office. One you can find through the Reliance, which is it comes out of I'm stuttering here because it used to be Calcasa and now it's Valoris. And the other was through Keith Kaufman, who now has his situational prevention work is going to be published through the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. So there are projects out there which you could look at the kind of situational prevention. And what I love about the one, they're very complementary. And then what I love about the one that that's now published through Reliance is that they used Nan Stein's work out of Wellesley. She's a researcher who looked at situational prevention in middle schools and did this really thing called hot zone mapping, where she had the students actually highlighted where they felt safe and where they didn't feel safe with red and green markers. And then in those places where it was red, they added additional sort of posters and extra monitors. And they did this study where they looked at situational prevention, like the environment, looked at educational intervention. They did some with both, and then they did some where they did nothing. And they found that, as you would expect, where they did both education and the situational prevention, you had the best impact. Yeah. But they found almost the same impact in terms of reducing perpetration in the areas they did no education, the schools they did no education, but they did do the situational prevention. So I think we focus so much on individual decision-making when we know that adolescents and also young adults don't always make the best decisions. So how do we also not only encourage them to make the best decisions, but also paying attention to the environment where they're in? And I think anybody who works with adolescents who's listening to that understands that you can't just ask the adolescents to change, you have to change the circumstances around that adolescent.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the earlier, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these are exciting innovations, Alejandro. These are things which, even though I've been working in the field for 30 years, I feel like there's a lot of innovations that are happening just in the last 5 years, really.
That's good. I have a daughter in middle school, and every once in a while we're like, "Oh my God, those boys are awful," and then she goes somewhere else and interacts with other boys, and we go, "Oh no, the boys at her school are actually really nice." But still, okay. What are some of the challenges that you have seen with respect to dealing with reports of sexual assaults on campus?
Yeah. Well, I think the one you mentioned earlier is that most students will not report, and there's many reasons. They care about the person that harmed them. They don't feel like there'd be enough sort of evidence to bring it up to an investigative process. They just don't want to go through what can be even equally traumatic investigative process. So just the fact that most problematic behavior on campus are not reported is sort of one, I think, huge challenge. And how do we address, especially from a prevention point of view, how do we address that 90%, and part of it, I think, is also like a switch in thinking, which I think is happening, because I think, again, for the first time in my career, I'm hearing people say, well, this could be my son. And not just like, what do I need to teach my daughter before she goes to college, but what do I need to teach my son? And that's, I cannot explain enough how much of a seismic shift that is.
Oh, yeah.
And campuses haven't yet, one of the challenges, I think campuses haven't yet adopted that shift. So for example, I gave a talk on a campus, and this is not a TMI moment, I hope, but I went to the bathroom, and and in the bathroom there was a poster. In the women's bathroom, it was a gender divided bathroom situation, and they had like, if you have been sexually assaulted, or sexually harassed, or if you have seen or know somebody, here's a number to call. And I just sort of asked what was, someone who went to the men's room, what was there. And first of all, there was no poster there. And there was no poster saying, like, if you think you might have crossed the line with somebody, here's some support, here's some help. So parents are beginning to get, like, what do I need to teach my son? What do I need to teach my daughter? Schools have not yet adopted that sort of perspective. And I think that is one really huge challenge, which I think schools are just beginning to think about. What do I do for the student who has crossed the line? And I don't necessarily, and just writing a paper is not going to be enough, so what do I do with that student? I think some schools are beginning to ask that question, and some schools are actually developing programs. I think before we started talking, you mentioned Princeton, and actually Tabashnik, who's a member of ATSA, has been working with Princeton for many years. University of Michigan has a really sort of stellar program that actually started, a number of years ago, but also was augmented by a program called STARZA, which was funded by the SMART office also. And also that what it did is it took evidence-based and like all the research that ATSA members know about and applied that to the college and the campus environment. So it is really the only research-informed program about how do you assess a student on a whole variety of behaviors where you're not talking about someone who's been adjudicated. This is somebody who there's been a finding of problematic sexual behaviors. And then what are either the educational interventions, if it's a fairly, if we're not talking about it needs necessarily intensive treatment, or what are the actually treatment intervention if we are talking about more serious problems. So I think that campuses don't yet have that, I think that sort of understanding and learning that many ATSA members have, that are really looking at the whole student and not just the behaviors. And last, I would say one of the challenges is that campuses are not incentivized in any way to look at the whole student. That where I think everybody with an ATSA would probably say you can't do an evaluation of anybody, whether they be adult or adolescent, if you just look at the behaviors. But attorneys are saying you need to be consistent. If somebody has raped, or somebody has stalked, or somebody has sexually harassed, you need to have a consistent response. And what STARZA begins to give them is a rubric to say not only that you want consistent, we want an effective response. And that again will be it's a challenge, but it's a shift that campuses need to think about, is like, if they're really concerned about safety, they want to have an effective intervention and sanction for that student, not just what the attorneys will want, which is a consistent one based on X behavior. So I could probably go on and on, but then we would use up the whole time just talking about challenges, and it's not very hopeful, I think, to do that. But there's a lot of challenges out there. Yeah.
Well, I think this segues nicely into the webinars that have taken place, and also about trainings for what does the training for colleges look like, and for clinicians that would want to help with this particular population.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that teeing up that question. So the Public Policy Committee of ATSA, as well as the Prevention Committee of ATSA, has been working together, collaborating on trying to have a stronger focus around campus sexual misconduct. And we have commented on the Title IX regulations that's gone through twice. We've also had done some policy papers. There's actually a wonderful sort of summary of if you want to look at sort of more what the research, what the overview, what we know about students, the traditional age students on campus. And what we felt was that there really is a difference in working with college students. One, in part because you need to understand, even though legally adults, they're developmentally adolescents. Also, the system they're working with, these are not students which have been adjudicated. So you're working with a non-adjudicated population. And there aren't any validated risk assessment tools or necessarily a lot of research around interventions. So there's a number, through all of that, what we decided through as our committee is to create a series of 4 webinars. And we've done 2 of them so far in the spring, and those are recorded and are available on the ATSA website. And there'll be 2 more in the fall. The 2 so far was just an overview of what you need to know about the campus world and Title IX and the Clery Act and all the different constraints and all the different sort of opportunities to address problematic sexual behaviors in the campus world. The second webinar was really looking at how do you sort of combine, like looking at STARZA, which is the program I mentioned, which is the only research-informed program which was developed by Dr. Robert Prentke, Dr. Mary Koss, Dr. Reina Lamade, and Elise Lopez, Dr. Elise Lopez. So those programs are that STARZA program, which is developed through funding of the SMART Office, is available through the NCJRS website. Also, you can Jay Wilgus and I are actually going to be conducting some trainings, which will be available in the fall as well about that. And then lastly, in the fall, the 2 other webinars, one will be by Katie Gotch, who will be talking about assessments and how do you use some of the assessment tools that are out there and what you want to look at differently around assessments in the campus world. And then Jennifer Sinicola is bringing together a panel of clinicians who are now working in the campus world. Saying how they're doing that, how they're doing their work in the campus setting. And then finally, there's going to be a workshop at the ATSA this coming year and this fall. If you're going to LA, as well as part of the meet and greet, there's going to be a specific campus focus. You can meet other people who are working in the campus world. And my understanding, you're going to have branded ATSA solo cups available if you go to that event as well. I don't think there's going to be any beer pong, but at least you'll get your solo cup as well. So there's a lot happening, and I think these 4 recorded webinars in particular, I would say if you're interested in the campus setting, it's absolutely worthwhile. They're 90-minute webinars that's worth listening to really get that kind of overview as you're interested in jumping into this world.
Absolutely, those are great resources. I don't know how YouTubers do the link is up there. I don't know how to do that, but the links will be in the description. That I know how to do. For anybody interested in those resources, they will be linked, and that's really good to know. I wasn't able to go to the webinars when they took place, so it's really nice that they are recorded. How have universities responded to the work?
Wow, I think there's probably as many responses as there are universities. Some universities, I think, like as I mentioned, University of Michigan, Princeton, University of Utah. There's a number of different. So the University of California system, have all really begun to sort of address the fact that they understand that there are students on campus who are causing harm, and trying to provide some resources for those students, as well as a way for victim survivors to report that, to make sure, like, who don't necessarily want to have that student kicked off campus, but want to have those behaviors change. So I think there's some fantastic, stellar examples. There's other schools which are ignoring it and just saying, sort of, it doesn't happen here, essentially, which is kind of, amazing. And I understand a little bit. When my daughter went to college, she went to Reed College out in Portland, Oregon. And one of the things that Reed is known for is that it has the third highest number of reported sexual assaults on, and as a professional, I'm thinking this is fantastic. This means that they have a system in place where students feel comfortable coming forward and getting help that they need. As a mom, it totally freaked me out. And I think campuses are struggling with that. How do you address those? And I think in one of the things that I personally found really sort of exciting, I did a study around this thing called transcript notation when I was at the SMART office as well. But one of the questions I asked is that, if a student has either a notation on the transcript or if they're a registered sex offender and they want to come to your school, what do you do about that student? And, there's schools which are open enrollment schools. And so that would not be a reason to not have a student attend. Certainly a place like Harvard or whatever, they can choose whoever they want to come to their, but what I found was that Northeast Iowa Community College was the only school that responded to say that if they had someone who wanted to attend the community college and was on the sex offender registry or had a notation on this transcript, they had an additional form to fill out so they could create a safety plan for that student. It makes so much sense. And yet there really was only one school in the entire country, and it was a community college in Northeast Iowa who had what I think was actually a fairly simple form that allowed a student to not only say this is what's going on, but to create a safety plan and support for that student to make sure that they're successful, which means that the school is safer. The fact that, so when you ask me what do schools do and how they're responding, it's literally across the map. But I don't think there's enough shining examples like the Northeast Iowa Community College. And I think that's the place where we need to have more shining examples like that, if we really do care about campus safety. I keep looking for them as well. I'll keep sharing them as I find them.
Yeah, I'm going to make a note about them. It is really striking. I mean, that obviously will decrease criminogenic needs if they're being supported and they're not ostracized and they're being given skills to be successful. It seems so logical and yet so difficult.
Yes. Well, just given the different reactions I had when it was my daughter going to school versus like when I had my professional hat on versus when I had my mom hat on. And it is difficult because I know exactly as a professional what makes so much sense. But as soon as you have a form like that on your website, it sort of announces we have sex offenders on our campus, and so from the PR perspective, campuses don't want to do that. And yet, if you really care about safety, that's exactly the right thing to be doing.
Yeah, that I can see that for administrators being so difficult, like, because the message is like, oh, your kid is going to be safe here, particularly for young women. But it's also interesting that there are no posters in gender bathrooms for men, because men are also victimized, and it depends on whether there are gender neutral. In my university, there are some gender neutral bathrooms, and it will be good to have stuff there.
Right, and important to have things like, if you're afraid that you crossed the line or you're not sure, who do you call? How do you find out that even if it's never been reported, but like, I'm not sure, and I think one of the interviews that Jennifer Hirsch often talks about from Sexual Citizens was, she would ask questions about, one of the questions among many was like, tell us about your, first they asked, can you define rape? Can you define what your sexual harassment is? And this was at Columbia, so most students could do that. And then in a series of questions, they asked, can you explain some of your worst sort of sexual experience? And she said a number of times young men would sort of start describing it, and then realize all of a sudden that what they're describing is rape. And they had never thought about that until this interview. And they thought of it as like a bad sexual experience, as opposed to the fact that how would it be viewed within the context of like a definition of rape? So having an opportunity for someone when they have that aha moment, like, well, then what do you do with it? Like, these are people who are trying to define themselves as a young person in terms of their masculinity, in terms of their femininity, to whatever, however they wanted to identify. And we're not giving them an opportunity to wrestle with those questions in a pro-social way. And so having something in the bathrooms that's also not only about if you've been harmed, but also if you think you've crossed the line. where do you go for help? Where do you ask those questions? Where do you have a chance to process what happened, even if it doesn't get reported, which we know most of the time it won't be.
This kind of connects a little bit with a previous individual that we had at the podcast on Nicole. Oh my God! Now I'm not going to remember the name, and that is just horrible. I told you about the dementia thing, so I have to work harder at it. She spoke about in researching college students. She's a sociologist. The finding that men who engage in hookups, in one-night stands, also reporting the wish to have an emotional connection, even if they're engaging in such what could be considered kind of like impersonal sex. So the education piece has to be there for them to be able to make that connection. In a sense, I see it like these young men who are looking back and saying, well, that wasn't a satisfying experience because it was one-sided. Yeah. That book, that class wasn't in the senior years, if I remember correctly. After they had gotten all the training prior to the first year, and then they had that class in senior year. It seems that there's a lot of information that needs to be given to college students all throughout as they grow.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And having just this one, most of the colleges require to have some sort of online course or some sort of orientation, and the fact that they can check that off and say they're done makes absolutely no sense. You can't expect someone to take no matter how good the online course is or how good the 1 hour orientation is, it doesn't give people the kind of skills that they need or the information that they need. And it opens up the conversation, but if the school doesn't actually invest in that, you're not going to be addressing how students change, and those 4 years are huge. So I think having a real investment in prevention is so essential. And again, some schools are doing that, and some schools are just ignoring the whole issue and pretending it's not happening. So if as you decide, you encourage your daughter to go to a school that has actually invested in this work, even if the reports of sexual assault are high, see what kind of intervention and programs they have there. That would be my advice to you, Alejandro.
Yeah. Well, we have come to the end of our time, Joan. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us. And this is in YouTube, so anybody anywhere in the world has access to this. So hopefully the title of sexual abuse prevention in colleges will show up in somebody's search everywhere, so that everybody is thinking about these issues, because unfortunately they're prevalent everywhere.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure talking to you as well, Alejandro. And I think there's so much more we can talk about. So maybe we'll have part 2 next year.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to visit us at atsa.com. Take care.